How to sew the mug carry case set. It's available in a choice of beautiful prints. Watch the video tutorial and I'll show you how to make your own mug carry case featuring a padded pouch and a matching mug rug. Cutting out. Take your panel and give it a press and have a look, and you can see that all the pieces that are needed to make the mug carry case are all printed on the panel with labels above each of them so you know which is which, as well as a label and some bonus extra prints. Cut out each of the pieces around the outer line, all the seam allowances are included, and pin the relevant label to the top edge of each of them. So you can see here I've cut out the outer pieces and the lining pieces for the mug carry case and put the labels on. Here are the 4 pieces for the pouch. You've got 2 outer pieces and 2 lining pieces. Again, I've pinned the label to the top. There's the handle and the pocket, and then you've got 2 pieces for the mug mat. You'll also need some wadding. I've used H640, which is a fusible wadding. The instructions for the sizes for this are in the instructions, and you will also need a piece of elastic and a button. I've used a piece of elastic from a face mask. Now, if you want to give your mug carry case some more structure, use some medium weight iron-on interfacing. I've used this on mine, on the lining as well as the outer, but it's up to you depending on how structured that you want your finished mug carry case to be. The instructions for putting it in are in the instructions. Making the pouch. To start off with, you need to add some padding to the pouch. So if you're using fusible wadding, press it to the wrong side of the pouch back outer and the pouch front outer. Or if you don't have fusible, then tack it into place. Because I'm using fusible, I'm now going to trim the wadding so that it is level with the raw fabric edges. So if you're using non-fusible, tack it into place around the raw edges and then trim it like this. This just gives your pouch some extra padding and makes your mug safer and more secure inside, and also will give your finished mug carry case a bit of structure. So now the wadding is level with the raw fabric edges. You can repeat that with the pouch back outer. Now take your 2 lining pieces and you need to pin the pouch front lining to the pouch front outer. I'm just moving the labels here so that they're not in the way of the seams. So place the lining and the outer right sides facing and matching the top raw edges. You'll see that it matches all the way around because the lining and the outer pieces are exactly the same size. Now pin it together along the top edge only. And sew across to join those 2 pieces together. You need to repeat this with the back pieces. So take the back outer and the back lining, place them right sides facing, matching the top raw edges, and then pin them together along the top. Make sure that the side and the top raw edges meet up so that you've got a neat finish. And then sew it together along the top edge only. Once you've done that, this is what it will look like. So open it out and press the seam open and flat. That's with the front one, and with the back one do exactly the same. Open it out and press the seam open and flat. Now place the 2 joined pieces right sides facing so that the outers match up and the linings match up. First of all, make sure that the seam joining them matches up. So push the pin through the seam at the top on the top pieces and then just pull it apart a little bit and make sure that the pin goes exactly through the seam on the pieces beneath. Then push another pin in. You can remove that marking pin. Turn it around and do it on the same on the other side. So making sure that the seams are still open and flat, push a pin through the top seam and through the bottom seam, and in this way you can make sure that the seams match up exactly. You'll get a neater finish at the top of your pouch. Now pin it together all the way round. Make sure the raw edges are matching. So I'm now pinning the outer pieces with the wadding on, with the raw edges matching. Pin it together across the bottom as well. and then pin up the other side. You don't need to pin around those cutout corners because they will be sewn later, not at this stage. So just pin down the sides and across the bottom. Now you can pin the lining together. Again, always make sure that the outer edges match up first. So I usually put a pin in the outer edge and then a pin in the centre, and then pin together along the other side. And then pin along the bottom. Now we're going to leave a gap in the bottom because we need to be able to turn the pouch right sides out when it's all finished. So pin it together at either end. And then to find the centre, just fold it in half and then make a little crease with your nail. And that's the centre. Now you need to leave a 3-inch turning gap. So if you take your tape measure and measure 1.5 inches either side of this centre crease, then you've marked a 3-inch gap, which is central. So place some vertical pins here, and then you'll remember to start and stop finishing. Now sew all the pieces together all the way around. Remember, don't stitch round the cutout corners and leave the turning gap unstitched. So you'll be working several seams. Once that's done, you can see the whole thing is joined together. Now to give the pouch some structure, we now need to box the corners. This is what will give it its shaped bottom. So take this, working on one of the outer pieces first, take the side and the bottom seam and place them right sides facing. Because of the wadding, the seam allowances may have closed up, so just open those out. Now make sure the side and the bottom seam match and pin together. Now lay the corner out flat and make sure just pop, if you run your fingers inside, or sometimes I use a narrow ruler, just to make sure that the fabric inside isn't creased up, and then pin it together across that corner. Now repeat that with the other corner. So again, take the side seam and the bottom seam, open up the seam allowances with you can do this just with your fingers to make sure that they're flat. By keeping them open while you're sewing, it just reduces bulk in this area. Make sure that the seam are matching. You can push a pin through like we did when we joined the outers to the lining, or you can just judge it by eye. Again, always make sure that the fabric, particularly when you're working with the wadded side, the outer side, sometimes the fabric can get a bit creased inside, so just make sure it's flat. And then you'll sew across there. I like to pin all my box corners and then sew them all. So I'm now going to pin the linings. The lining corners are boxed in exactly the same way. These are a little bit easier because you haven't got the wadding, so it's easier to open up the seam allowances. Again, make sure the side and the bottom seams are matching. Pin together, lay it out flat, make sure that there are no creases and you've got those nice diagonal shaped edges, and pin together across there. And then for the final corner, again, match the side and the bottom seam, open up the seam allowances, pin together, lay it all out flat. You can press these before you pin if you prefer to get crisper edges. Now you've pinned all the corners, you now need to sew across all of them. Once that's done, it will look like this. So take out any extra pins that you've left in, just make sure they're all out. Now put your hand inside the turning gap, grab hold of the corner of one of the outer pieces and pull it all right sides out through that gap. If you've left any labels on, you can remove these now, you won't need them anymore. Push your hand inside the gap to just push out those corners. It's easier to do that now before we close the gap, so just push out the corners. Now to hold the turning gap closed, make sure the edges of it are still folded inwards. They'll be folded inwards by 1/4 inch because that's the seam allowance. So just make sure they're folded under and then pin the turning gap closed in a couple of places. And then sew together all the way along to close the turning gap. Once that's done, you can now push the lining inside the outer. Make sure you push out the corners so that the lining corners sit right inside the outer. Now take the top seam, this is the seam that joins the outer to the lining, and roll it between your fingers so that it lays right on the edge. It's worth giving it a press at this stage too. Now top stitch all the way around the top edge to hold the lining inside and to neaten. And now your pouch is finished and you're ready for the next stage. Making the case lining. Take the pocket and fold it in half widthways with wrong sides together. So you're matching the short ends and its wrong sides together. Now give it a press along the bottom fold and top stitch along the top edge. This is going to be the top of the pocket. Then it will look like this. Now take the long case lining, place that right sides up and place your pocket on top so that you're matching the bottom and the side raw edges. If you've got a print direction on your pocket, make sure that the prints are running the same direction down the long case lining and down the pocket. Pin it together down the sides and across the bottom. Now tack it into place. So make sure if you're working a machine tacking, you sew it within the seam allowance. Once that's done, your pocket is attached. Take the short case lining and place that right sides down on top so that the top edge of the short case lining matches the bottom edge of the long case lining with the pocket. Match that up and sew it together. Again, make sure that the print direction of the long case lining and the short case lining is running in the same direction when you do this. Sew it together so you're sewing through all the layers and then press that seam open and flat. And the case lining is now finished. Assembling the case. Now if you want to add interfacing to your case, press it at this stage to the wrong side of the case outer and the wrong side of all the joined case lining pieces. Again, this is optional, but will give your case more structure if you do this. Now to add the elastic, you need to mark the centre of the top curved edge of the case outer. If you fold it in half, matching the side edges, and make a little crease, you'll find the centre, or you can measure it if you prefer. Now take your length of elastic. You can use a hairband for this, narrow elastic, or I've actually used face mask elastic because it's nice and soft and stretchy. Now take the two ends of the elastic, fold them so they make a loop, and pin them to that mark. But you need to have the ends of the elastic extending beyond that pin mark. So they need to extend 1/2 inch beyond the pin mark. This stops the elastic pulling out. If you place the elastic right on the edge, it can easily pull out through the seam when you're using your mug carry case later. So pin it along the top and then pin it a little bit further down as well. This is just to keep it straight during assembly. Then tack it into place across the top and a little bit further down, and then your elastic loop will be nice and straight. Once that's done, you can see I've got a loop tacked nicely to the top. Now place the case outer and the case lining right sides facing, making sure you match up the curved top edge, the straight side edges and the straight bottom edge. So start by pinning the curved top edge together. Then pin it together at the bottom corners. Make sure that the bottom and the side raw edges match up. I always like to pin at one end of a seam and then at the other end of the seam. Then you can pin together across the centre. You get a more even finish this way, and you can make sure that the edges match up. So you can see here I'm pinning through the interfacing. Some of our kits have a quilting weight cotton in them, some have a canvas. If you've got a canvas kit, you won't need the interfacing. It's if you have the quilting weight cotton that you will probably need the interfacing, but you might only want to put it on one side, the outer or the lining, not both. It's entirely up to you how much structure you want it to have. Now you need to leave a turning gap in that bottom straight edge, so fold it in half to find the centre, and just like you did with the pouch, measure 1.5 inches either side of that centre mark and mark the edges of that with vertical pins so that you remember to leave the turning gap unstitched. And now you've now got a 3-inch gap marked centrally in that bottom straight edge. So sew together all the way around, starting at one side of the turning gap, all the way around the curved edge. Reverse stitch over the elastic when you meet it to give it some extra strength, and stop stitching at the other side of the turning gap. Once that's done, they will all be joined together like this. Now, to help it all lie flatter when you turn it right sides out, trim off some of the fabric from the corner close to the seam, but not actually through the seam, so take care not to cut the stitches. Now, on the curved edge, you need to reduce some bulk from this seam so that the seam lays flatter. So what I'm doing here is cutting out little triangles just along the curved section only. And this just reduces the fabric bulk in this area. And I'm also going to trim the seam allowance in half. Again, you'll find that the curved edges will lie flat if you do this. Don't cut off the ends of the elastic. It's really important you leave those there because that's what stops the elastic from being pulled out. So on the other corner, cut out little triangles, making sure you don't cut the seam. And then the curved edge will lie nice and flat. And again, I find also trimming the seam allowance in half really helps, but just on the curved edge, you don't need to do that all the way around. Now turn the whole case right sides out. Put your hand inside the gap, grab hold of one of the bottom curved edges and pull it all the way through the turning gap. Now push out the corners with your fingers, just to make sure they're lying on the edge, and then do the same along the curved edge. You can use a blunt point for this if you prefer to make it all lie on the edge, and then also remove that second set of tacking stitches that are holding the elastic down flat, because the elastic needs to be faced upwards. Roll the seam between your fingers so it's lying right on the edge, and then give it a press. Then, to finish the case out, a top stitch all the way around the top edge. This neatens it, adds extra strength to the elastic and holds everything nice and flat, and it will also hold the turning gap to the inside. Attaching the pouch. Take the pouch that you made earlier and you need to press the bottom edges. So take the corner of one box corner and across to the other, lay it flat on your ironing board and press it. And then do that on the other side. So you take one corner, pinch it between your fingers, take the other corner and press. And that gives a nice structured bottom, and you're going to need these pressed edges for sewing it in a moment. So take the case and place it lining sides up. Now on the bottom edge of the pocket, place the pouch. You will see that pressed and creased edge will fit just underneath the bottom of the pocket. You'll also see that the pouch is almost the same width as the case, a little bit less, so make sure it's central. I found that mine was about 1/8 of an inch shorter either side. So pin it just either side and then across the centre, so that creased edge needs to lay along the bottom of the pocket seam. Now fold the boxed corner that you've got and pin that down the side. Obviously there's a lot of bulk here because you've got the wadding in here, so if you just pin through the outer part, so the upper edge of the seam, so you can see the boxed seam I've got just sort of tucked underneath, so that I'm just pinning through the top layer of the outer fabric, not through the seam itself because it's too bulky. Turn it around and do that along the other side. So making sure that the box corner is laying flat, pin it into place through the case lining and through the fabric that's just above the seam. Now pin the other straight press side into place between those two edges. Make sure it's lying nice and flat and pin it into place just on the pressed crease and into the case lining. Now you have to hand sew this pouch into place. You can't really do it by machine, it has to be hand sewn, but this is fairly easy. So all you need to do is cut twice as much thread as you need, so you've got a doubled over thread. Thread the two the ends in the needle, and then you'll have a loop at the other end. This is the easiest way. You have a doubled over thread because it makes it stronger. So starting in the top right hand corner, push the needle up through the bottom corner of the pouch, and then don't pull it all the way through, push the needle through the loop and then pull it all the way through, and you've got a nice, neat, strong start. Now we're going to slip stitch the pouch into place. So push the needle through the case lining only, not the case outer, and then into the edge of the pouch. Making a short vertical stitch, push it back through the case lining and into the pouch. So check every now and then to make sure you're not stitching into the case outer, because you don't want to see these stitches on the outside. And then continue to do this all the way along. You can space these stitches further apart than you would normally do. I'm spacing mine about half an inch apart because we're going to sew round it twice. I find it easier to make these small slip stitches to get the positioning right, spaced a bit further apart, and then go round again. So working a long stitch through the case lining and a small stitch into the outer, slip stitch all the way round until you get back to the beginning. So I've done that and I'm back to the beginning again. So you can see I've slip stitched it in place all the way round. Now work another row of slip stitches, but this time work them between the others. So the first slip stitches held it into place and the second will give it extra strength. So bring the needle up in the centre of the first row of slip stitches, make a short vertical stitch, back under the case lining and up again between the last lot of slip stitches. So this 2 rows of stitching helps with positioning and also gives it extra strength. And then just continue to slip stitch it in place all the way around until you get back to the beginning, and then work a few stitches on top of each other to secure the thread. And now your pouch is attached to your case and it will look like this. You now need to sew the flap, which is the short case lining section, on top of the pouch. So fold it upwards, making sure it's nice and straight and even and isn't pulling the pouch at all, but just laying flat. Pin it in the centre and then pin it either side. Now, to make sure that you've got it nice and even, I would just quickly measure to make sure that it's the top of the case is the same distance from the top of the pouch, and adjust it if it's not. And then pin it into place across the top and then down the sides. This again makes the case come up onto the pouch, but also is another row of stitching to secure it properly. Now, in the same way as you did before, slip stitch around the side, across the top and down the other side. You don't need to go along the bottom, and then do it again. So you've got 2 rows for strength. And now your case is attached to the pouch and it's all nice and neat and strong. So to just finish this section, turn the top edge of the pouch over to make a little cuff, and turn it over so that it just covers the top of the case outer. Just a little bit, just to make that neat, and make sure you've turned it over by the same distance all the way around. You can measure that if you like, and give it a little press. And then the case and the pouch section is almost finished. Making the handle. Take the handle piece that you cut out earlier and you can remove the label. Now you need to turn both short ends over by 1/4 inch to the wrong side. So if you measure 1/2 inch from the one raw short end, fold the raw end over to meet up with those 2 marking pins, then you've turned it over by exactly 1/4 inch. And give that a little press to hold. And then turn the other short end over by 1/4 inch to the wrong side as well, and I've just done this in advance. Now fold the handle in half with right sides facing but lengthways this time. Fold it at one end and pin it together, making sure those short ends stay turned under and that you've pinned them under. And then do the other end, pin it together, just making sure that the short ends stay turned under. And then pin it in the centre so that you've pinned the whole thing in half lengthways. And then sew it together just along that long edge. When that's done, press the seam open and flat at this stage. It's easier to get a neater finish later. And then turn the whole handle right sides out. I'm going to use a turning tube for this because it's such a short one. I'm not going to bother to tack across the end. You can just fold the end under and turn it right sides out. Take the stick out and then just make sure that those ends stay turned under. So just pop them back in if they've come out at all. And then press the whole handle flat so that the seam is laying on the top edge. Because you pressed it open earlier, it's a lot easier to do this. So press it all along the top edge and then top stitch around all four sides. And then your handle will look like this, nice and neat and stitched all the way around the sides. Adding the handle and button. So to make sure that your mug carry case fits your mug, put your mug inside and then fold the case out on top. And then you can make sure that it fits your mug exactly. Then pin the elastic into place at the bottom of the loop because this is where you're going to sew your button on. And the button will be sewn at the bottom of the loop. So just pin that into place for now. Now take the handle, and the handle needs to be placed so it goes across the centre of the top, so that when you carry your case, the handle is in the centre. So pin it together, pin it in place at one side and then at the other. The handle will loop between the ends so that you can carry it. So just make sure that the handle is lying across the centre of the top. Now you can take that pin out, but just make sure that you put it back in just in the carry case outer, undoing the elastic. Take the mug out now, and then although the pin is in the right place down the case, it might not be exactly centrally across. So just take your tape measure, find the centre and move the pin so that it's in centrally across but still the same distance from the top. And then I'm just going to pop the pin in to make it secure. To make sure that the handle is central as well, you know that it's the right distance from the sides, but just measure from the bottom of the handle to the end of the carry case outer, that's the curved edge, and just make sure both ends of the handle are the same distance, adjusting one of them if not. It'll only be a little bit, but it just helps if you make it straight at this point. Now we can sew the button in place at that pin mark. So take your needle and thread and a button, push the needle through where that pin mark is, then you can take the pin out, and then pull the thread through, leaving a little bit of an end, you can cut that off later, and work a couple of small stitches on top of each other just to secure the thread. And then you can snip off that end. It's just easier to secure it if you've got a longer end, it doesn't pull all the way through. And then simply stitch the button into place, making sure that it lays exactly on where you've started. Now you can sew this through all the layers of the outer and the pouch if you want, because the sewing will be on the inside. But just to make mine a bit neater, I just sewed it so that it only went through the case outer and part of the pouch, but I didn't want the stitching to be seen on the inside. It doesn't matter too much if it does, because obviously this will be on the inside of your pouch. So just work several stitches all the way through until your button is neatly secured. And now you can sew the handle into place. So sew it into place at either end in a square with the cross through the centre of the square, and that just gives it extra strength. And then your handle will look like this. And it'll loop in the between to hold it, and then when you fold the elastic loop over, it will loop round the button to hold everything closed. Making the mug rug. Take the rug front and the mug rug back and place them right sides together. You'll also need the piece of wadding that you cut out earlier. The measurements for this are listed in the instructions. Make sure all raw edges are matching and place the two pieces in the centre of the wadding. The wadding is a little bit bigger than the two mug rug pieces. It just makes it easier for sewing it together. Now pin the three layers together all the way round, starting at the edges to make sure the raw edges of the outer, the front and the back of the mug rug are matching up. And then you can pin between those edges. You need to leave a turning gap in one of the short sides. 2.5 inches is about right. So if you measure and mark the centre of this short side, and then if you measure and mark 1.25 inches either side of this central mark, then that will be a 2.5 inch turning gap left. So place vertical pins to mark the edge of the turning gap, and then sew together all the way around, starting one side of the turning gap and then finishing stitching on the other side of the turning gap. Once that's done, you can now trim the wadding, because the wadding needs to be the same size as the fabric. So just trim it all the way around so that it's level with the raw fabric edges. You can trim the wadding so it's closer to the seam if you want, but I like to have it close right up to the raw edges because it gives a nice extra padded border, slight border to the edge when you finish later, but that's up to you. So for me, I'm just trimming it level with the raw fabric edges. Now cut off the corners. That just reduces the bulk in this area, making sure that you don't cut through the stitching, but you'll get neater corners when you've finished. With the turning gap, fold it over by the 1/4 inch seam allowance and just press it. You can either do this with your finger or with an iron. That just helps to keep it folded to the inside. Now push your fingers inside the turning gap, get hold of one of those bottom corners and turn the whole mug rug right sides out. Push out the corners with your fingers, or you can use a pointed but blunt item. I like the wooden stick for my turning tool. I use that often to turn mine out, just to make sure that the corners are all nice and neat in the edges. Once you're happy that everything is turned out nice and neatly, fold the edges of that turning gap to the inside. You'll be folding them under by 1/4 inch, so it's the same as the seam allowance, and then pin them together, making sure the seams lay right on the edge. Top stitch all the way around the edge, and you can also add any other quilting details at this stage if you want. So you can see here I've top stitched around the edge, and then I also top stitched around the inner border, but it's up to you what extra details you add. You can quilt around some of the other elements if you like. Everything is now finished now, so take your mug rug, fold it in half and pop it in the pocket, and that'll keep it nice and safe. You can then use the pocket for storing tea bags, coffee sachets, sugar sachets, or even a few biscuits. And then all you have to do, pop your mug inside. The padded pouch will keep it nice and safe. Loop the elastic around the bottom, and your finished mug carry case is ready to go. It makes a beautiful gift if you're buying someone a mug, and it's brilliant for taking on holiday, to work, on workshops, because your mug is always to hand and safe. Then when you want to use it, take your mug rug out of the pocket, pop your mug on, and you've got a nice little coaster to keep it in then, and then just put it all back together again to finish.